For all intents and purposes, losing campaigns are usually forgotten about. They are discarded into the dustbin of time as a collection of also rans. Even those who win the nomination of their party, like former Vice President Walter Mondale, can be totally forgotten about just a few years after running for the highest office in the nation. But then there are those candidates that we remember, those candidates who do or say something that sticks in our minds forever. Sometimes it's a stupid photo op or other outlandishly bad ideas that the campaign thinks would be good. But then it's sometimes a simple quote or what a candidate says that is enshrined in our memories forever. In this video, we are going to look at 17 political quotes that either destroyed a political career, indicated that a candidate was headed toward defeat, or just something negative that showed that the writing was on the wall. Hello everybody, my name is Dave and welcome to Election History. I make videos about campaigns, elections, candidates, political parties, and the likes. If this is the kind of content that you like, please subscribe to the channel. If you would like to support the channel further, you can become a member of my Patreon. And one final announcement on my website voting trend, I have been developing an extensive precinct map and district ratings for the upcoming elections. You can support the channel as well by becoming a member on Voting Trend and get something extra as well for it, especially if you follow current campaigns and elections. Now, let me start this video by saying that these are some of the quotes that I could think of off the top of my head. This means that I might be missing some blatantly obvious quotes. If you can think of some other quotes, please put them in the comment section below. If there are enough that warrants a second video, then I'll make a second one. And in addition, I really couldn't find any quotes from the United Kingdom. Sorry, but I think politics there might just be too tame. So if you have any good quotes, list them down below. Also, I have never done any type of video like this before. I'll be going back to my regular history videos for the next video, but let me know if this kind of content is the kind of format that you might like. Now, on to the list. Of course, some quotes don't always destroy political careers, but show that a political career has already run its course. The first person we are going to look at is Jeb Bush. During the 2016 Republican nomination for president, Jeb was one of the early frontrunners. But as the campaign moved on, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and Marco Rubio moved ahead of Bush, pushing him further down the list. After finishing a disappointing sixth in the Iowa caucuses, with Ben Carson and Rand Paul finishing ahead of Bush, the first primary was in New Hampshire. It was at this point that the only people still with Bush were his diehard supporters. But it was easy to tell that Jeb was done and enthusiasm in his campaign had dwindled to nothing. On February 2nd, 2016, in Hanover, New Hampshire, he said that the next president of the United States should be quieter and focus on acting in the nation's security's interest instead of acting like a blowhard. He expected a good reaction, but instead,
please clap.
Yeah, that showed how desperate Bush actually was. He finished a distant fourth in New Hampshire and dropped out of the race on February 20th. Since then, he's been absolutely absent from the political scene, and if you want to watch a detailed video about Jeb's first run for public office, you can check out this video here. Yes, I know that I'm starting to sound like Elizabeth Warren saying that I have a video for that, but a lot of times I do. Let's stay with the Bush family and move to Jeb's father, George. At the 1988 Republican Convention, many within conservative Republican circles thought that Vice President George Bush, now the nominee for the Republicans, might raise taxes. During his 1980 campaign for the Republican nomination, Bush criticized Reagan's economic policy. 8 years later, here he was needing to reassure conservatives that he was on board. At the convention, Bush famously said,
"But I will and the Congress will push me to raise taxes and I'll say no, and they'll push and I'll say no, and they'll push again and I'll say to them, read my lips, no new taxes."
Of course, this didn't hurt him in the 1988 presidential election, which I talk about more in detail here, but in the 1992 presidential election, which I talk about in detail in this video, it did hurt him, as he did raise taxes during his term as president. And I know there will probably be some Republicans in the comments saying that Bush was forced to raise taxes because of the Democrats in Congress. Well, no, he could have just always vetoed the budget. Anyway, the Clinton campaign pounced on it, and his read my lips promise ended up getting Bush 4 years later. Of course, saying that you're going to cut taxes is one of the biggest promises that candidates running for office make, even if they have no intention whatsoever of doing so. But what if a candidate actually tells you that they want to raise taxes? Well, that's exactly what Walter Mondale did 4 years before George Bush's promises of no new taxes. At the Democratic National Convention in 1984, former Vice President Walter Mondale wanted people to trust his candidacy in what would eventually become an uphill battle to win. To show his honesty, Mondale said,
"Mr. Reagan will raise taxes, and so will I. He won't tell you. I just did."
Yes, promising to raise taxes isn't exactly the best campaign strategy, and Mondale would go on to lose 49 states in that presidential election. But Mondale wasn't the only Democratic presidential candidate who was a little bit too truthful when it came to their public statements. So was Kamala Harris. After vice president, wow, there seems to be a lot of vice presidents on this list. Anyway, after Vice President Harris was selected as the Democratic nominee, because, let's be honest, all of the delegates were Biden delegates and simply rubber stamped Harris as the nominee once Biden dropped out of the race. Anyway, while Biden's horrible debate performance was a contributing factor for him dropping out, so was the fact that inflation was high and people were feeling the squeeze on everything that they bought. Still, the Democrats were oblivious to the plight of the average American. And while Harris and her vice presidential candidate, Tim Walz, both acknowledged the economic problems that hit Americans, they had no solutions. People didn't want to continue Biden's policy. However, when she appeared on The View on October 8, 2024, she was asked the following.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
Yeah, voters wanted change, and this wasn't the answer they were looking for. From this point forward, Harris's numbers plummeted, and she lost the presidential election, being only the second Democrat to lose the popular vote since 1992. Sometimes a political quote doesn't destroy a campaign, nor does it even show desperation. Sometimes a politician says a quote because they know that they are quite confident, rubbing it into their opponent. This was the case in the early 1990s with Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating. After a leadership spill that saw Bob Hawke out and Paul Keating in, many pundits assumed that the Labour Party was done for. However, the Liberal Party, now under the leadership of John Hewson, introduced a plan called Fight Back, which was a mixture of spending cuts and tax cuts for businesses, but also instituted a goods and services tax of 15%. All Hewson had to do was to see how promising to raise taxes helped Walter Mondale. Anyway, Keating knew that this was an unpopular policy, and instead of talking about his own economic plan, he constantly just let the Liberals continue to defend Fight Back, which started chipping away at support for the Liberals. During a sitting of the Australian House of Representatives, Hewson attacked Keating for not wanting to talk about the Liberals' Fight Back policy. After Hewson's question,
"If you are so confident about your view of Fight Back, why won't you call an early election?"
Because, mate.
Order.
The answer is, mate, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
Essentially, Keating knew that no matter what he said, the unpopularity of Fight Back would lead Labour to victory. In the docuseries Labour in Power, which I highly, highly recommend if you want to know more about Australian politics. Labour Senator Reg Withers said that fight back was what killed the Liberals in the 1993 election. Labour scored the upset victory, with Keating living to fight another day as Prime Minister. Sometimes releasing a 650-page economic policy like Fight Back might not be the best decision, especially when the results will be met with criticism. But that's still better than not knowing your own policy at all. In 2011, Texas Governor Rick Perry announced that he was seeking the Republican nomination for president. Early on, Rick Perry was battling with eventual nominee Mitt Romney, being within the margin of error of Romney in many of the polls. During the campaign, one of Perry's campaign focuses was to slash the federal government, going as far as to even removing departments from the federal government. During a debate on November 9th, 2011, Perry was asked about those departments.
Commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there? Let's see.
EPA?
EPA, there you go. No, okay.
Let's talk deficit.
Seriously? Is EPA the one you were talking about? Or?
No, sir.
You can't name the third one?
The third agency of government,
Yeah.
I would do away with the education, commerce, and let's see. I can't. The third one I can't. Sorry.
Yeah, that didn't help. His campaign went south from that point on, with Perry eventually dropping out just before the South Carolina primary. Of course, not knowing what you want to do as president while running for president with all of the nation's cameras pointing at you isn't great. But sometimes people just scream on stage. Yes, you know where I'm going with this, and yes, I've already made a video about Howard Dean's political career, so check that out. Going into the 2004 Democratic primary season, Howard Dean was the frontrunner in most of the polls. But in the weeks before the Iowa caucuses, Dean dropped from being a strong first to falling to third, with both John Kerry, who we will be talking about soon, and John Edwards moving ahead of Dean. And honestly, Dean didn't really do anything to actually lose support. It was just that voters had a change of heart. Still, after Dean finished third in the Iowa caucuses, he was advised by his campaign manager, Ted Kennedy campaign flunky Joe Trippi, as well as Senator Tom Harkin, to go out there and give them hell. Now, personally, I think the actual scream gets more attention than it deserves, because it was just more than the scream. Honestly, the whole thing looked absolutely unhinged. So here's the clip.
Not only are we going to New Hampshire, Tom Harkin, we're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico. And we're going to California and Texas and New York. And we're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House. Yeah!
Yeah, that didn't look good. The only primary that Dean would win was the Vermont primary, and that was months after he had already dropped out of the race. But it is true that being emotional can lead to your emotions getting the best of you and saying something that you might regret being caught on camera. That can be said for our next politician, George Allen. Allen was in a tough re-election bid against former Secretary of the Navy Jim Webb. One of the things that Webb's campaign did was to have campaign staffers follow Allen's campaign and record every one of his public appearances. One of those who followed Allen was S.R. Siddharth, an American citizen who was born in the United States, but of Indian descent. He had attended a number of Allen's events and eventually became a familiar face to Senator Allen. On August 11, 2006, at Breaks Interstate Park in rural Southwest Virginia, Allen finally snapped.
This fella here over here with the yellow shirt, Macaca, or whatever his name is, he's with my opponent. He's following us around everywhere. And it's just great. We're going to places all over Virginia. And he's having it on film, and it's great to have you here. And you show it to your opponent because he's never been there and probably will never come. So it's good for you. Rather than living inside the Beltway, or his opponent actually right now is with a bunch of Hollywood movie moguls. We care about fact, not fiction. So welcome, let's give a welcome to Macaca here. Welcome to America and the real world of Virginia.
Not only did Allen use a racial slur, with macaca being closely the same as monkey in French, but also implied that Siddharth wasn't American, which he absolutely was. At the time, Allen was leading in every poll, sometimes outside the margin of error. But after this incident, which was plastered all over television and the internet, the race got closer. Webb would go on to win the election by less than a half a percent. Another person who might have said something that he wished he could take back was Gary Hart, former senator of Colorado who is making his second run for the presidency in 1988. Hart, along with New York Governor Mario Cuomo, were considered the frontrunners for the Democratic nomination. But once Cuomo decided that he wasn't going to run for the nomination, Hart was the clear frontrunner. But even with this being the case, it was known in Washington circles that Hart was probably a less than faithful husband and had numerous affairs. In an interview that Gary Hart conducted with E.J. Dionne, which was published on May 2nd, 1987, Dionne asked Hart if he was having an affair. Hart denied it, saying, quote, "Follow me around, I don't care. I'm serious. If anybody wants to put a tail on me, go ahead. They'd be very bored." End of quote. Well, someone did put a tail on him and investigated his past. On the same day that the New York Times published their article, the Miami Herald published an expose on Hart, which said, quote, "Gary Hart, the Democratic presidential candidate who has dismissed allegations of womanizing, spent Friday night and most of Saturday in his Capitol Hill townhouse with a young woman who flew from Miami to meet him. Hart denied any impropriety." End of quote. A few days later, the Herald reported that Donna Rice was the woman who met with Hart, and she denied that there was anything going on between the two. But the media dug deeper and found that the relationship between Hart and Rice had been going on for a while and had met a number of times on a yacht called Monkey Business, which Rice had confirmed. With the mounting pressure against him, he dropped out of the race on May 8th. If there is anything that people remember about the whole Gary Hart incident, it was the picture of Rice sitting on Hart's lap. However, this photo wasn't released until June 2nd, 1987 in the National Enquirer, nearly a month after Hart had already dropped out. So, no, Hart didn't win the Democratic nomination. The person who would go on to win the Democratic nomination in 1988 was Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. And yes, I've already made a video about that campaign. Anyway, Dukakis was now the Democratic nominee and had to take on the Republican nominee, Vice President George Bush. By the time of the October 13th, 1988 presidential debate at UCLA, the Dukakis campaign was already in freefall. Attacks on his record were fast and furious, and his record of being against the death penalty were constantly being brought up by the Bush campaign. The death penalty became the wedge issue that made it look like Dukakis didn't share the values of most Americans. But it wasn't the Bush administration that dealt the fatal blow, but instead CNN anchor Bernard Shaw, who was the moderator of the debate. Shaw opened up with the following.
Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life.
Yes, the campaign was sinking, but now it was sunk. George Bush would dominate the general election, with that debate performance killing Dukakis' chance of winning. Another poor debate performance was that of Canadian Prime Minister John Turner in 1984. When Pierre Trudeau resigned as Prime Minister of Canada in 1984, thus the leader of the Liberal Party, he was replaced by John Turner, who defeated future Prime Minister Jean Chrétien for the Liberal Party leadership. Immediately, an election was called, which saw Turner pitted against new Progressive Conservative leader Brian Mulroney. But before leaving 24 Sussex, Trudeau made a deal with the Liberals. Trudeau, who was becoming less popular with each passing day, said that he would only resign early if the incoming Prime Minister, whether that was Turner or Chrétien, appointed a number of people to patronage positions. Trudeau himself had already appointed 200 people to these positions, but Turner, now the new prime minister, appointed an additional 18 people that Trudeau wanted in. This basically smelled of corruption, though this was and still is a practice that happens in Canadian politics. This became one of the most contentious issues of the 1984 campaign. When asked about the patronage positions, Turner tried to answer it as diplomatically as possible. Here's the exchange.
Well, I've told you and told the Canadian people, Mr. Mulroney, that I had no option.
Well,
Truman, your next question.
You had an option, sir. You could have said, I am not going to do it. This is wrong for Canada, and I am not going to ask Canadians to pay the price. You had an option, sir, to say no, and you chose to say yes to the old attitudes and the old stories of the Liberal Party. That, sir, if I may say respectfully, that is not good enough for Canadians.
I had no option if I was able
That
to.
is an avowal of failure. That is a confession of non-leadership, and this country needs leadership. You had an option, sir. You could have done better.
Mr. Turner, your response, please. I've just said, Mr. Moderator, taken the Canadian people through the circumstances. Mr. Trudeau had every right to make those appointments before he resigned. In order that he not do so, yes, I had to make a commitment to him. Otherwise, I was advised that with serious consequences to the Canadian people, I could not have been granted the opportunity of forming a government.
This sank the Liberal Party's chances, and Mulroney swept into office with a commanding majority. Another Liberal Party leader who was absolutely destroyed in a federal election debate was Michael Ignatieff. After the Liberal Party under Paul Martin lost to Stephen Harper's newly merged Conservative Party, which merged the old Progressive Conservatives and Preston Manning's Reform Party, the Liberals went with Stéphane Dion, a political science professor from Quebec. But the Liberals would lose more seats in 2008 and replace Dion with Ignatieff, who was also a political science professor and spent much of his life overseas. Once Ignatieff became Liberal Party leader, he acted more like he was a prime minister in waiting instead of simply being the leader of the opposition. Granted, once Ignatieff became the leader of the opposition, the Liberals did improve in the polls, but that didn't last long, as Stephen Harper looked as if he was headed for a majority. And while Harper showed up for Prime Minister's questions, Ignatieff had a less than impressive attendance record. This was something that NDP leader Jack Layton wanted to make known. Layton's NDP were already starting to make inroads in Quebec, where they had only won 2 seats previously, one of which I talk about in this video here. And when the debate came, Layton delivered one of the best blows in Canadian political history.
I have to pick up on something Mr. Ignatieff said. He said before you have to walk the walk and you have to be a strong leader and respect Parliament. I've got to ask you then, why do you have the worst attendance record in the House of Commons of any member of Parliament? If you want to be Prime Minister, you better learn how to be a member of Parliament first. You know, most Canadians, if they don't show up for work, they don't get a promotion.
Mr. Layton, I don't surrender to anybody in my respect for the institution of Parliament and my obligation to the people who put me there. So don't give me lessons about respect for democracy.
Well,
don't give me lessons.
Where
don't
were
give
you
me
when
lessons
I was
for
there
respect
standing up to
about our
Mr. Harper and voting against his policies, and you weren't in the chamber? You missed 70% of the votes. I think you need to understand a little bit more about how our democracy works. That's my only point.
Within days of that debate, the NDP went from being a distant third to being tied with the Liberals. A few weeks later, the NDP would finish second, forming the official opposition. In the province of Quebec, the Liberals were almost wiped out, with one MP, Justin Trudeau, holding on to his Papineau riding. And yes, I will eventually be doing a video about the NDP and Jack Layton. And with that, let's move back stateside to the 1976 presidential election. This was shaping up to be one of the closest presidential elections in history. The Democrats had nominated Jimmy Carter, the former governor of Georgia and peanut farmer who was basically an unknown. I talk about that nomination campaign in this video. As for Gerald Ford, he had been catapulted to the presidency due to the resignations of Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon, and defeated Ronald Reagan in the Republican primaries, which I talk about in this video. Anyway, this election could have gone either way, and the debates became one of the determining factors to win undecided voters. The first debate was uneventful, with the exception of the debate being stopped for 27 minutes because of audio trouble. But the second debate was about foreign policy, particularly regarding the Cold War. This is where Ford could have stood out, as his foreign policy resume was much more impressive than that of Carter's. In a question about the Helsinki Accords, an agreement that sought to ease tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, one of the debate moderators, Max Frankel, asked Gerald Ford this.
Mr. President, I'd like to explore a little more deeply our relationship with the Russians. They used to brag back in Khrushchev's day that because of their greater patience and because of our greed for business deals, that they would sooner or later get the better of us. Is it possible that despite some setbacks in the Middle East, they've proved their point? Our allies in France and Italy are now flirting with communism. We've recognized a permanent communist regime in East Germany. We've virtually signed in Helsinki an agreement that the Russians have dominance in Eastern Europe. We've bailed out Soviet agriculture with our huge grain sales. We've given them large loans, access to our best technology, and if the Senate hadn't interfered with the Jackson Amendment, maybe you would have given them even larger loans. Is that what you call a two-way street of traffic in Europe?
What has been accomplished by the Helsinki Agreement? Number one, we have an agreement where they notify us and we notify them of any military maneuvers that are to be undertaken. They have done it in both cases where they've done so. There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone, whereas on our side of the line, the Italians and the French are still flirting with
I
possibility
don't believe, Mr. Frankel, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Each of those countries is independent, autonomous. It has its own territorial integrity. And the United States does not concede that those countries are under the domination of the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, I visited Poland, Yugoslavia, and Romania to make certain that the people of those countries understood that the President of the United States and the people of the United States are dedicated to their independence, their autonomy, and their freedom.
This alone was probably enough to tip the election over to Carter, as it indeed ended up being one of the closest elections in recent history. Another election that was expected to be close was the 2004 presidential election. The Democrats nominated John Kerry, who had an impressive resume, but didn't exactly have the star quality of somebody like Bill Clinton. In fact, Kerry had his Michael Dukakis in the tank moment when he won out windsurfing. Essentially, Kerry's campaign was being compared to Dukakis' campaign, with one PR blunder after another. However, one of the quotes that sank him really wasn't his fault, but taken out of context. In 2003, Kerry supported an $87 billion fund to continue military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, with part of the condition being that the Bush tax cuts for wealthier Americans would be eliminated. Kerry voted for that version of the bill, but when the final bill didn't remove the tax cuts for the wealthy, Kerry voted against it. When asked in a town hall meeting about this, Kerry explained that he first voted for the bill, but then not the final version. This led Kerry saying that he had voted for the bill before he had voted against it. This led to Kerry saying, quote, "I voted for the bill before I voted against it," end quote. The Bush campaign would take this out of context, only use the "I voted for it before I voted against it" quote, and made it look like Kerry was a flip-flopper. Kerry would go on to lose the election by a larger margin than expected. I tried to find a longer clip, but I can only find one very low-quality clip of this incident on the internet. Sorry about that. Another person who would lose by a large margin 6 years later was U.S. Senate candidate Christine O'Donnell in Delaware. This was a special election to replace outgoing Senator Joe Biden, who is now vice president. Initially, the natural successor to Biden was Mike Castle, who served as governor of Delaware as well as the state's sole member of Congress. In fact, the Democrats really didn't even put up a fight, putting up president of the new Castle County Council, Chris Coons, as their candidate. However, 2010 was the Tea Party year, with the Republican candidate who ran against Joe Biden 2 years earlier, Christine O'Donnell, making another run for the seat. In an upset, O'Donnell defeated Castle in the Republican primary and took on Coons in the general election. During the general election, old video clips of her on Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher surfaced, in which she said that she dabbled in witchcraft, which led to Democrats making fun of her being a witch. But instead of brushing it off as nonsense, the O'Donnell campaign decided to run a commercial.
I'm not a witch. I'm nothing you've heard. I'm you. None of us are perfect, but none of us can be happy with what we see all around us. Politicians who think spending, trading favors, and backroom deals are the ways to stay in office. I'll go to Washington and do what you do. I'm Christine O'Donnell, and I approve this message. I'm you.
Honestly, I thought it was a good commercial. However, the only thing that anyone remembered for the commercial was that O'Donnell was saying that she was not a witch. That was it. O'Donnell would go on to lose to Chris Coons by over 16% and has been pretty quiet since. The next quote doesn't come from an election in which a candidate won or lost, but from a referendum. In 1995, Quebec was on the verge of declaring sovereignty, with a referendum being held to determine whether the dream of Quebec's premier, Jacques Parizeau, was going to be realized. Most of the polls in the late stages of the campaign had the yes side winning. A yes win was so likely that the Canadian government was moving military assets out of Quebec in case the referendum passed. And for Parizeau, he intended on immediately going to Quebec's National Assembly to pass a resolution declaring Quebec's sovereignty without the consent of Canada. But in the end, the referendum lost by a very small margin, thus ending Parizeau's dream. If you want to watch a great documentary on this, check out The Breaking Point, which was done by the CBC. Anyway, after the defeat, two of the main people on the yes side, Mario Dumont and Lucien Bouchard, gave thoughtful concession speeches. But for Parizeau, he gave a more, let's say, impassioned speech than the others, saying,
Mes amis, c'est raté, mais pas de beaucoup. Non. Puis c'est réussi. C'est réussi sur un plan. On est... Hey, si vous voulez, là, on va cesser de parler des francophones du Québec, voulez-vous? On va parler de nous. À 60%, on a voté pour. C'est vrai qu'on a été battu, au fond, par quoi? Par l'argent puis des votes ethniques, essentiellement. Alors, ça veut dire que la prochaine fois, au lieu d'être 60 ou 61% à voter oui, on sera 63 ou 64 et ça s'ira. C'est tout.
With heavy criticism immediately after the speech, Parizeau would resign as Parti Québécois leader and premier the next day. Of course, it was the money in the ethnic vote quote that painted Parizeau by many as a racist. But according to future Parti Québécois leader Jean-François Lisée, one of the biggest problems is that Parizeau identified those in Quebec as nous, or us, meaning that those who were the true Quebecers were francophones. One could say that this was the beginning of the split of the allophone population, those whose native language was neither English nor French, over to the No Side campaign and strong supporters of the Liberal Party. And finally, we come to the most avoidable gaffe of all, and that's Ted Kennedy's response to Roger Mudd's question about why he wanted to be president. I talk more about Kennedy's campaign in this video here, but this one doesn't really need any introduction. The question itself provides the context, so here you go.
In personal interviews, he can become stilted, elliptical, and at times appear as if he really doesn't want America to get to know him. Why do you want to be president?
Well, were I to make the announcement and to run, the reasons that I would run is because I have a great belief in this country that it is, there's more natural resources than any nation of the world, as the greatest educated population in the world, the greatest technology of any country in the world, the greatest capacity for innovation in the world, and the greatest political system in the world. And yet I see at the current time that most of the industrial nations of the world are exceeding us in terms of productivity, are doing better than us in terms of meeting the problems of inflation, that they're dealing with their problems of energy and their problems of unemployment. And it just seems to me that this nation can cope and deal with its problems in a way that it has in the past. We're facing complex issues and problems in this nation at this time, but we have faced similar challenges at other times. And the energies and the resourcefulness of this nation, I think, should be focused on these problems in a way that brings a sense of restoration in this country by its people in dealing with the problems that we face, primarily the issues on the economy, the problems of inflation, and the problems of energy. And I would basically feel that that it's imperative for this country to either move forward, that it can't stand still, or otherwise it moves backward.
As with Dukakis's campaign, Kennedy's campaign wasn't going well at this point, and this just hammered in the last nail in the coffin. And with that, those are the 17 most devastating political quotes that I can think of that either ended political careers, ambitions, or gave us the impression that the end was nigh. Well, thank you all very much for joining me in today's video. Tell me if you would like me to do more videos like this. Remember to subscribe to the channel, and if you've made it this far, give a thumbs up. Join my Patreon if you want to support the channel, but I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.